Hello, everybody. My name is Schultz-Zehden, and I have the pleasure to present to you today the second part of the MSP webinar, all about the objectives of maritime spatial planning. I am the Managing Director of Sustainable Projects. We have been involved in MSP processes right from the beginning since 2001 and have managed a whole series of projects which were building on each other, starting off from Bulk Coast, which finished in 2004, where the whole concept of maritime spatial planning actually was created, moving then to a project which was combining maritime spatial planning in the Baltic Sea, but also having comparable projects in the Adriatic as well as the Black Sea, and which had the main result to really develop the first ever handbook on how to develop maritime spatial planes. This we then sort of moved into implementation in the Baltic Sea with the large project Seaplan, which ended up also in the finding of Seaplan, and especially developed pilots across the Baltic Sea region, and which was sort of the groundwork for the later on MSP Directive being adopted at European Commission level, which meant that actually as of this year, in 2021, all coastal states across the European Union have to have maritime spatial plans in place. And this is indeed also the case in Poland, but where the MSP has been adopted this year, as well as all other Baltic Sea region countries. Some are still in the process, but will actually have their first maritime spatial plans adopted still over the course of this year. And all the other projects were then sort of going more into the details of how to do these kind of maritime spatial plans. So Participate was looking especially into transnational coherence, and then this being translated in the project Baltic Scope, as well as then Baltic Lines, and I will refer to this later on. And now currently we are in the phase of already looking into sort of support to the implementation of the maritime spatial plans being adopted. So really over the course of the past 20 years, quite a success story in the European Union, and especially in the sea basin where we are based, in the Baltic Sea region, where we can be proud that all countries are really having these processes now adopted. So let's look a little bit back into the terminology. Many of you, when you read about maritime spatial planning or MSP, you may sort of also come across other terminologies, be it sea use planning or marine planning, coastal zone management, sea use zoning, marine spatial planning, or what is now really adopted in the European Commission, maritime spatial planning. The reason why there are these various terminologies is that basically when MSP was invented, there were simply these different terms used. And we should also understand that worldwide, MSP is very often called marine spatial planning, because here the environmental aspect is also taken on board. Whereas in the European Commission or in the European Union, we should always see maritime spatial planning and the related directive in the relationship with the so-called MFSD, the Marine Framework Strategy Directive, which had been adopted earlier on and which is really the so-called environmental pillar. Therefore, the MSP Directive in the European Union is putting focus more on human uses, whereas the environmental aspect is actually sort of taken on board by the MFSD, all of which is then combined in the overarching policy, which is the integrated maritime policy. So just this in terms of the different terms. When I now talk about MSP, it is really that I mean maritime spatial planning. The definition of maritime spatial planning is really about the process of analyzing and allocating human activities in the sea. And this according to the spatial distribution. Clear, we are talking about spatial planning. So this really means where do these human activities take place, as well as then the temporal aspect that, not all human activities in the sea are taking place at the same time. Sometimes we will see in maritime spatial plans really various human activities being allowed at the same space, but not necessarily at the same time. Because we are now talking in this webinar really about objectives, and here you can already see the type of objectives this maritime spatial planning should actually achieve. So it should achieve ecological objectives, economic objectives, and social objectives. What we normally call sustainability, meaning that it's definitely the environmental aspect, but taking on board also the human dimension, meaning that we actually also want and need to use marine resources, and therefore also have an economic dimension behind it, the so-called blue growth or blue economy term, while at the same time also taking on board with regards to the spatial distribution that we also have to take care of coastal regions which are not central to metropolitan areas, and that we therefore have to think about who we actually want to benefit with the human activities we are supporting on the maritime space. This definition, which was done earlier on in the groundbreaking work of UNESCO IOC, which was actually based on the projects we had implemented before, as I have just shown to you, Plan Coast. As you can read yourself on the slide, this definition has really been taken on board almost 100% by the European MSP Directive. Here, the only distinction and the only change which has been done is that really the political public process has been allocated to the member states' authorities. Basically, it's quite simple. In terms of the storyline, is that we all know spatial planning on the land. We all know that here we have agricultural land, we have industrial sites, we have room for transportation, but we also then have space allocated for where we can live, where there are villages and cities. And this really has never ever been done before with the ocean in the decades, in the thousands of years before. And why was this not the case? It was the freedom of the ocean, where basically ships can go everywhere, fishery can be everywhere. But this has been changed over the course of the past decades, that we see that there is more and more human activity taking the space of the maritime area, taking the space of the oceans, and that some of these activities are also now more and more fixed. If we think, for instance, of the offshore wind installations. And this really required to think about really allocating the space also in maritime areas to specific uses. Basically, what you see here, and this is what is normally seen as the process before, because of course there was already planning and permitting in the years before the invention of maritime spatial planning for certain activities. So of course, if you wanted to do sand and gravel mining, for instance, or if you wanted to install an offshore oil and gas platform, if you wanted to have offshore aquaculture, you still needed already permission, a license in order to do so in a given space. The difference between this single sector planning and the now maritime spatial planning is that we go away from the single sector planning, which does not sort of take into account the other activities which are already taking place in the maritime space, to sort of look into a multi-sector planning exercise where the various uses are sort of, considered, and where therefore it's really sort of taking a holistic picture where these different activities should really take place. In reality, I have to tell you that over the course of the past maritime spatial planning processes, which have now sort of been implemented in the coastal states, we have seen that actually many of the sectors you can see here on this slide did not even have a comprehensive sector planning. It was even here that the licenses for even a single sector were sort of almost given ad hoc manner, so that when now maritime spatial planning processes started, that this was very often combined, in a sense, part and parcel with actually inducing for some sectors to actually come up with their own spatial sectoral plan first, and then to sort of, have the combined picture across all the sectors, and then to see where are sort of the optimal sites for each single sector, and where are then sort of the compromise optimal sites for all the sectors in a combined way. What is the situation? What is the change maritime spatial planning has induced? Before, you can see that it was incremental, as I say, almost ad hoc planning for each single economic sector. So each sector was taken at its time. There was little or no coordination across government agencies. There was also little or no coordination among the different levels of government, meaning, between municipal, regional, national, or even transnational level. Therefore, the allocation of uses was actually done with little regard for other uses and also with little regard for nature. And now on the right-hand side, you can see how this picture is changing with an integrated approach as it is done by maritime spatial planning. Here, the planning is really done on a cross-sectoral basis, taking transport, nature conservation, fishery, but also new uses into account. It's a horizontal integration, stemming from nested approach to transnational objectives on a vertical basis. And basically that therefore also other uses are considered, and especially also consideration is taken on board of nature. And here not only on a single basis, but again, taking the different economic sectors together, and this is very important, to actually think about what is happening when we have different sectors together in a certain area, what is actually the cumulative effect from these different sectors on nature itself. So having said all this, and basically to think about the overarching benefits and therefore, of course, objectives of maritime spatial planning, there are quite a multitude of benefits we can achieve. So basically, it takes into account the ecosystem, and here really what is important about the sea in contrast to the land, that we actually have to take sort of what we call the 5D, the 5-dimension level of the sea into account. Meaning that if you take a look at a plan, you may actually see a different uses being allowed at a given site. However, some of them may sort of, be happening at the bottom of the sea, or in the column of the sea, or on top of the sea, or even above it, thinking about the birds which are sort of flying over the ocean itself. It really embraces a multi-sector cooperation and therefore also identifies potential synergies between different users in order to really benefit from these synergies and not to have these uses side by side only. And this is what we nowadays call multi-use. It's a much more efficient government planning because it takes the planning of all government levels together, and it increases the certainty, therefore, also for investments. If you think about, for instance, offshore wind installations, where very often it takes more than 10 years from an initial plan to the actual realization, that therefore it is important that with maritime spatial planning, they have security about the space which has been allocated to them. And therefore it actually also induces more investments to come because it actually also takes into account, it shows new ocean space. It actually also then really links into sort of ensuring that optimal sites, the best sites, are used for a given sector. It's for the stakeholders involved in maritime spatial planning, all the different sea users in space. It is a process which ensures transparency. So it's not sort of this secret behind the doors licensing process where, the first runner is sort of having the one who comes first gets the license first. No, it actually ensures transparent process and therefore also a better acceptance for change across the various stakeholders being involved. And last but not least, I would like to emphasize that it also is ensuring that ocean space resources are actually left open for future generations. The objective of maritime spatial planning is actually to have an efficient approach to the allocation of uses, meaning that you only plan as much space as you definitely need to plan. The objective is to really keep as much space open for, the many future generations to come and potentially new uses, new technology advancements, but of course also to leave as much space open for nature itself. And what is also good and the benefit of maritime spatial planning, that it does minimize or prevent conflicts to happen in the first place by already sort of thinking about what kind of conflicts could be there between different sectors, between sectors in nature, and thereby it may be that the process itself will take longer in the first run, but then as the result, you have less conflicts which may even be taken to court later on, and thereby thinking back about the certainty for investments, preventing that a lot of planning is done, for instance, for an offshore wind installation, which is then later on prevented by court. So the overarching planning process is actually reduced in time. You can see also the picture of, the need of interaction, the process within a country itself, where, yes, we all have seen that there is a given MSP authority in each country, where the authority is actually quite often diverse. In Sweden, we have the Ministry of Environment. In Estonia, the Ministry of Finance is actually responsible. In Germany, it's the Ministry for Transport. So they come from quite different angles. But regardless from which angle they are coming from, they are required to actually cooperate with their fellow ministries or agencies being involved, and thereby sort of to ensure in the governance process that there is a multi-level as well as cross-sectoral approach enshrined into the overarching process. Let's move again to the specific motivations for maritime spatial planning in specific countries. So we have seen already sort of the benefits from an integrated approach itself, and that it has a purpose in itself. But the driver for the need of having a planning of the sea in itself has been quite different across the different countries globally going for maritime spatial planning. The first country where actually maritime spatial planning was almost invented was Australia. Here, the idea was to really have a better management of the marine protected areas for the Great Barrier Reef. And the process was here to really sort of manage the human uses in a better way to enhance the protection of the marine protected areas within the Great Barrier Reef, because it was evident that without sort of planning also the human activities, the goals of the marine protected areas could not be achieved. So here the driver was very clearly to enhance the environmental protection. Whereas then later on, when MSP came into Europe, here the driver was quite different. Here the driver was the emergence of offshore wind installations as new players. As I have said before, these offshore wind parks are of course an infrastructure which is suddenly really sort of, taking space away from the maritime area, where in many countries it is not allowed, for instance, to have fishery within an offshore wind park. And, as we all clearly know, of course, it's also not possible to have an offshore wind park within a major sea transport area. But if you consider that what I have said before, that until then there was the freedom of the ocean with freedom of the sea for ships going everywhere, fishery being everywhere, this was really a complete change of perspective. What is also different, if you say, well, there has been offshore oil and gas before, is that obviously offshore oil cannot be found everywhere. So here, basically, the site selection is already bound by the resource, where the resource is actually to be found. Wind is blowing everywhere in the ocean. Of course, there are better places and more suitable places. Very typically, especially in the early years of offshore wind installations, that again here, the closer you got to the coast, the closer you got to sort of shallow water areas, the more cost efficient the offshore wind installations to be. And very often we are therefore also thinking about the combination of integrated coastal zone management, because we see sort of in terms of conflicts that the pressure, the amount of space, the amount of uses taking place in a space is rapidly increasing the more and more the closer we are coming to the coastline. Therefore, also with one objective to be is with maritime spatial planning to really also show new areas which are not as close to the coastline as they have normally put into the map. So with offshore wind, we got a new player suddenly, and we had to allocate the space. We had to think about where are the best places in combination, both for the wind developer, but as well as with the other users. And of course, also with, who we call user, the stakeholder who is living by or visiting the sea nearby, and therefore normally wanting to enjoy the open side of the sea. This does not have to be only a tourist, can of course also be the people simply living at the coastline, and for whom it was a new visual element suddenly to have an offshore wind park actually stopping from this open side. Again, here the question, how far should the offshore wind parks be from the coastline in order to prevent conflicts with the coastal inhabitants or the visitors to the coastal regions. The third objective, as we can see here on the left-hand side with the crowded picture of the Baltic Sea, is that obviously the pressure to do maritime spatial planning was increasing, especially in those countries who have not so much maritime space available, or actually in areas of given countries, Gulf of Gdansk, for instance, as an example, where there is a specific area where there are many users coming together. So it does not really come as a surprise that the countries which do not have so much maritime space available, be it, by the way, also Germany, but actually also Belgium, for instance, or Lithuania, were among the first who were introducing maritime spatial planning, and not so much the countries which have a lot of maritime space available. Because these countries, for national reasons, still want to sort of have as many users in their own given space. Taking again the example of Germany, where there are also not so many other resources available in the country itself to produce renewable energy. We do not have hydropower. We do not have forests. Therefore, we have to go, to a certain extent at least, into offshore wind in order to meet the renewable energy targets in view of production of energy in our own given space, in our own given country. And of course, there are other examples as well that for strategic, also political reasons, that each country, even if you do not have so much space, obviously wants to have a port available, wants to have tourists, wants to have potentially also aquaculture. So here one could argue, okay, you can use also another space, but other interest points of view, it's very often that the first runners have been countries with not so much space and which were therefore needed to sort of plan this space more efficiently. And now let's take a look at some of the examples. So here I have already talked about it. The first country, the first region, European-wide, which adopted a maritime spatial plan was actually the coastal land, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where actually this is now showing already the second maritime spatial plan which has been designed, but there was a first one adopted in 2004. And here, as I said, the main reason being the areas for offshore wind to be allocated. And here you can see these areas and you see how crowded it is in the sense of having here major sea transportation areas, but of course also marine protected areas, which also take space if we think about the Natura 2000 regulation, where countries have to allocate protected areas, nature protected areas, and therefore of course also having a proportion, a percentage of these nature protection areas allocated within their marine space. Let's take another example, again from Germany. Here you see the North Sea, and if you see therefore here the dimension, as you have seen, this is the map I have shown before in terms of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And here you see sort of the space available in terms of the North Sea, which of course you could argue a really big space if you sort of take it into account that this is showing here the area of Denmark. So we have space available, which is pretty huge. But if you then sort of think about it, that basically all this area in the coastline, there is not even a plan here, because all this is the so-called Wadden Sea, and all this is nature protected, and therefore no use being allowed in this area. Therefore, if you see here sort of the sea routes, and here you see nature protection areas, the question was where to place the energy. And this is actually the old maritime spatial plan, which was adopted in 2009 in Germany. And by now we are in the second generation, and due to sort of the new requirements, also due to climate protection, there has been much more pressure for new offshore wind installations. And you therefore will actually see that all this here is also by now almost been taken by offshore wind installations. So let's take another example, Netherlands, again also with actually not so little space available, but actually with also a lot of offshore wind energy targets as well as nature protection areas. And here you can easily see that this is actually also getting more and more crowded. There is also a need, there have also been countries where actually maritime spatial planning has been taking place, where not so many users were out there yet. So where you could argue, well, we do not have to really sort of decide between the different users. There is no actual conflict taking place. But planning is really about preventing conflicts, and it's about planning for the future. So to see the sea. Here you see the area of Lithuania, where there are not so many users yet. But the idea being, and this has really sort of also then happening, is that via this map to show to also the political but also the business community that, hey, there is a space out there which you can use, and you can use it sustainably, and where you can therefore really sort of have a better utilization of the maritime space from an economic point of view. Moving back to Lithuania, what they really did is that they were showing a specific area which was called the economic area. in contrast to the more, here you see the western part, where it was both for nature protection as well as actually as a use, also for defense reason, left free, also for future uses. And another example in terms of seeing the sea is here the so-called middle bank, which is a shallow area in the middle of the Baltic Sea, where you can see here the border running through between Poland and Sweden, and where, because it's a shallow area, on one hand, it's an important fishing ground, but secondly, it's therefore also not only a fishing ground, but also a nature protection area. And at the same time, because it is shallow, has been on the picture for quite many in view of offshore wind installations. The offshore wind installations were not there yet for the Maritime Spatial Plan. But, what was achieved by the Maritime Spatial Planning was a cooperation between the two countries involved, Poland and Sweden, in order to really think about how to use the space in the best way together. And secondly, to think about where could specifically offshore wind take place in order not to compromise this important nature protection area. So it has become a development area also for an economic use, but at the same time also complying to nature protection areas. How can this then concretely look like? You see here sort of the Danish draft Maritime Spatial Plan, where I have now taken out only the aspect of development zones for so-called shellfish farming, and where you can see sort of that there are quite a number and quite specific areas allocated to this use. And here, therefore, you have sort of the positive picture in terms of showing from the Maritime Spatial Planning point of view, here, shellfish farmers, you can install this use. But of course, you can also do it in a different way. And here you see the draft Maritime Spatial Plan developed by Estonia. And here to have a look at the upper right side, that a Maritime Spatial Plan can actually also show areas which are not allowed for a given use. So you can always take the two objectives or the two perspectives. On one hand, taking the positive side, here is a good place, as well as then sort of having an allocation of areas where you can show very clearly to investors, don't even think about it. Here, it's not allowed to come in with your use. Moving back to objectives. So we have seen there is a small space, or there are emerging uses, there is nature protection. But there is also the other dimension, which are transnational objectives. Because overarchingly, of course, the sea is very connected. It's not, as if national borders, as if the fish will sort of comply to national borders. The nature itself, birds will not comply to national borders, as well as then, of course, also having human activities, the classical one, the shipping, which is, of course, such a transnational activity in itself. Another objective is that one can really develop transnational routes, transnational perspectives for certain uses. Already in 2009, VASAP, which is the Baltic Sea-wide initiative for spatial planning, showed here its long-term perspectives to have really so-called motorways of the sea. So where the ships are not sort of having no barriers like a motorway and can sort of, ship efficiently throughout it without any kind of use interfering. So to really have intelligent sea transport corridors, but then at the same time also thinking about the so-called energy supergrids, to think about where are sort of the cables, where are the offshore wind parks established, and does an offshore wind park in Sweden, in Germany, etc., will that only comply with a cable to the respective national border, or could it not also be that it is connected to another country bordering also this offshore wind park? So the so-called energy supergrids. And therefore also to establish a common approach for Baltic Sea maritime spatial planning. And here you see actually the example of it, what I have just said. Here in terms of the cross-border element, that transnationality means here that not only countries with a direct border have to sort of cooperate within the maritime spatial planning, but when it comes to shipping or energy routes, that actually there are also cases, and I show it later on, where you have to consider the shipping route from country B also in the country E. So where you really have to think about sort of the coherent transport route, as well as here the coherent energy lines. And we see here sort of a sample of what this means. This may be difficult for you to see, but it's a picture of the maritime routes of Sweden and Lithuania, Kaliningrad, and the Polish border. What is remarkable that for these countries, this shipping route is very important because it is landing at a port. This shipping route here, which is, as you can see, then sort of really connecting nicely and is really sort of, taking account the shipping route from Lithuania and Latvia, is actually from Poland, is not important for Poland because it is sort of not landing at a port to Poland. But the Polish colleagues have taken this into account because they actually knew about this important shipping route through the maritime spatial plans already being in place in Lithuania and Latvia. You can really prevent mismatches, and in order to what could have easily taken place if this would not have sort of been shown on a map, that instead of a shipping route here, an offshore installation would have been installed, meaning that then this shipping route would have been blocked for these other countries. You really can sort of prevent such kind of mismatches. And at the same time, cross-border with the objectives of transnational maritime spatial planning, you can also actually sort of identify where are hotspot areas for joint planning. And here it's really about cross-border areas. And I had already talked about the Middle Bank before, but there are many other areas, for instance here, the so-called Kriegers Flak, an area between, again, Poland, Sweden, and Denmark, where all three countries are interested in developing offshore wind, and where through the planning itself, an optimal allocation of space has been achieved. Here you actually see sort of really concrete cross-border areas where there may actually also be transnational conflicts between very important ferry routes and an offshore wind installation, a conflict between nature protection and fishery and sand and gravel installation. Let's have a look what it says in the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive itself at the EU level on what the objectives of maritime spatial planning should be. In the first part of this paragraph, this regulation, you again see it back in terms of our early on definition, in terms of really taking into account economic, environmental, and social aspects. However, in order to really achieve growth and development of the blue economy, but at the same time also apply an ecosystem-based approach, so taking into account the environment itself, as well as then coexistence of relevant activities. What kind of uses should sort of the member states take into account? Of course, energy, transport, fisheries and aquaculture, but also the preservation and the improvement of the environment. And what is ever so important in now our decade of climate change adaptation is actually to also take into account the resilience to climate change impacts. In terms of other human uses that member states should also consider sustainable tourism and extraction of raw materials. But that all this is actually in the competence of the member states and not the European Commission itself. So basically, how the different objectives are reflected and weighted in the maritime spatial plans by the given countries is the competence of the member states itself. In terms of the role of maritime spatial plan in driving sustainable blue growth, we have to consider MSP in two ways. One is that MSP is maritime spatial planning. So it's a process where the result, the final product, is then the maritime spatial plan. Very important is in terms of meeting the objective of a sustainable blue economy is that the process is already important because it brings people around the same table. We have heard before, it's really about cross-sectoral cooperation, it is about synergies, etc. And what is the beauty of maritime spatial planning is that suddenly sectors, stakeholders are coming into dialogue which have never ever talked before with each other, and therefore suddenly sort of understand also the objectives of other sectors, the needs of other sectors, and come very often to synergies which are completely beyond spatial planning itself, which is really about using the resources of the different human activities together in order to sort of come to a more efficient process. Within this process, the question is now, how do we actually get to these objectives? Because in the end, it's about objectives, it's about a vision. It's about what you want to achieve in 20 and 30 years' time. And so the question is really what to plan for. What do we need to consider today in order to reach this vision? We should always remember that a maritime spatial plan is very different from the map of the current activities on the sea itself. A maritime spatial plan is actually taking into account both what is already out there, as well as then mapping, showing the plan for future development areas. So it combines the two of it. And on that basis, we actually have to know what these objectives are. And this is here where therefore we are showing the process that the stakeholder engagement is really all about sort of thinking jointly of what we want to consider. By thinking about the future, you very often get sort of the today conflicts between different sectors into a new level to really think about sort of what are our common objectives, what we all are working for together. So it facilitates a thinking outside the sectoral bubble. So it really raises awareness of emerging issues, thinking about climate change, thinking about demographic change, thinking about biodiversity issues. Very often when you think about this vision, then suddenly sort of very different players are actually sort of coming, of course, to a similar vision in the sense that we, of course, want to have a balanced, healthy sea in the future. What is not so easy in terms of these objectives to really translate them then into then spatial needs. We have had many exercises over the course of maritime spatial planning where many people could say, oh, we want to have a healthy sea. We want to have, however, also 20% more renewable energy. The question is, for instance, when we think about renewable energy, very often these objectives are then translated into only energy targets. So basically, we want to have as much giga energy from the ocean. But it does not really say what does this mean in translation for how much space we have to allocate and where we have to allocate the space. So what you need to do is really that you have to analyze the different trends in the different given maritime sectors, and you have to sort of think about the spatial implications and how you then can sort of consider them in maritime spatial plans and how you then bring them together. And this is exactly what we did also in a past exercise in the project, which was very influential in the Baltic Sea region in view of defining the Baltic Sea Plan Vision 2030, where we first analyzed the sectoral policies, the horizontal policies, and thought about, how important are these policies and their priorities in view of these spatial implications. And then sort of identified the spatially relevant trends in key sectors and explored them in two potential scenarios, two potential development pathways, and brought those then together in a sustainable development vision, which then from 2030, in terms of this vision, was brought back in terms of defining what do we need to do today. And this was back in 2013. So what does it mean if we want to have offshore wind parks in a certain area? We actually have to think about planning them today. When we think about wanting to promote multi-use, this is something where we cannot sort of do it after we have given a license to an offshore wind park or after we have given a license to an aquaculture development. No, we have to think about sort of giving combined licenses to these two different sectors. And we actually have to think about where is then the optimal side in the sense of enabling the offshore wind to take place in the same space as also the aquaculture space. Because it may be that the single consideration, so in terms of the offshore wind park as well as the aquaculture development, may sort of come to conclusions of different spaces where they would be optimal for them from a single use perspective. But if we come back to the objective that we want to keep as much space available to future generations, we actually have to think about how to sort of use and allocate this space in an efficient way. So therefore, we have to look consciously for spaces where it's good for aquaculture, perhaps not optimal, but good, as well as good for offshore wind, perhaps not optimal, but optimal from a multi-use perspective. And as a maritime spatial planner, we actually already have to think immediately to sort of give this license on the condition of really telling the offshore wind developer that they will only get this license if they let this other sector also in, and thereby inducing that also the offshore wind is developed the park itself is developed in such way that it is, good to use also for aquaculture, and of course vice versa. Moving back to, again, objectives. What are the different types of objectives? You see here sort of the different levels of objectives. So we have sort of the overarching blue growth objective, blue economy objectives. But these are not very often in the direct control, in the direct remit of a maritime spatial planner. First, what is definitely in your control is so-called MSP process objectives, where you actually say, okay, in our planning process, we have the objective to really, for instance, consider all stakeholders. You have to think, therefore, in terms of the objective, you should sort of set your objective that you have been really involving all the stakeholders, that all the stakeholders really have given their voice, and that, all these stakeholders, all their objectives have been considered. But then you also have sort of the objectives for the maritime spatial plan itself. And here I have already talked about it, that very often you will see sort of, quite loose objectives, in the sense we want to have a sustainable sea, we want to have a fruitful blue economy, we want to have also nature protection. But these are quite woolly objectives. So basically you have to sort of define these objectives into so-called smart objectives, into concrete objectives. What is smart? Smart is, of course, about objectives which are measurable, they are specific, they are achievable, they are relevant, and they are time-bound. Specific means not simply saying we want to have a thriving blue economy. We want to have a healthy environment. Specific means that you have to say, well, we want to achieve 20% improvement of the biodiversity, or we want to have 50% increase in offshore wind development. This is specific, and it's then also measurable if at least you have defined a baseline for this before. So if you, for instance, say we want to have an improvement by 20% in biodiversity, you obviously have to have already a baseline on where your biodiversity in your given sea area is at the current stage and where it should be in 10 years' time, in 5 years' time. Relevant means that it should be an objective which you can really influence with spatial planning, and which is not actually completely sort of dependent on external factors which are not in the hand of your MSP process. This is going back to the types of objectives. It's important that these are the lower objectives, are the ones which are attributable to maritime spatial planning, but that the sort of higher level of objectives, you will find that they are very often, not completely in the hands of a maritime spatial planning process, because, of course, the development of offshore wind energy is depending on the economic condition of the country, to the existence, perhaps other technology developments in terms of other renewable energy sources, be it solar or any other types of energy, which may also sort of simply mean that offshore wind is no longer so attractive. There are many other policy areas which are coming in, innovation policy, research policy, etc., which are then influencing whether these overarching objectives can be achieved via maritime spatial planning. But the lower ones, in terms of have you actually found enough space for a given use? That's, of course, something which is in your hands and where, again, you should sort of develop this in a smart way. Coming back to that, in terms of setting smart objectives, here is a checklist in terms of, have you really considered everything in terms of, setting your objectives? So have you considered blue growth? Have you considered the national strategies and regional strategies, the sectoral objectives, but of course also environmental and biodiversity objectives? And have you sort of defined the different levels of these objectives and translated them into the logical structure? Also in terms of then setting these objectives with, again, sort of indicators to show whether, later on in the process, the maritime spatial plan really has achieved the objectives you have set. You have to think about, have you chosen indicators which are linked to these objectives? And here I come back again to the SMART tool. So basically, are the indicators relevant? Are they specific? Are they actually measurable? And are they also simple to understand? This is only possible. You can only measure and you can only think about objectives. And funnily enough, this is very often forgotten, that you have to define your baseline values. So where are we today in our situation with our maritime space? And where should we be in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? In order then to sort of really come to your target values and therefore your impact in terms of the priorities which you have defined in the plan itself. And here, again, sort of the checklist for the definition of target values, which is very similar to what I have said before, but it's important for SMART objectives that you actually have a target value. Otherwise, they are not SMART because you cannot measure them. And now I come to my final slide in terms of what does this mean concretely. I have talked about offshore wind production already for quite some time during my presentation. So let's go through the objective, as I have mentioned, in terms of the production of renewable energy at sea. That here the objective, as given in political targets, is very often by 2030. So this means, in terms of objective for the planning decision, that you should actually allocate areas suitable for wind energy production at sea, as well as then the related cable routings and sort of also the limitations. And you have to think, however, is the area you have therefore allocated for such wind energy production sufficient to reach the above mentioned target? Then if you have this in your maritime spatial plan, means that as an immediate outcome, the renewable energy operators will have knowledge about the availability of space. So they have investment security. So we come back, we round up our cycle of objectives in terms of this overarching objective and benefit of maritime spatial planning, that they actually have security about this space, and that this is also then having been considered in relationship to other uses. And for the details, here you may also consider whether the maritime spatial plan has actually been really transported. Has this message been conveyed correctly to the given stakeholders? And therefore, then in terms of the intermediate outcome, that the permit applications are not only submitted, but that they are issued according to the area you have allocated. And you can also ask evaluative questions on whether, the environmental impact assessment, which is following always then the specific installation, that, these have sort of come to positive outcomes, which would mean that you have done your maritime spatial plan process in a good way. And therefore, then in the long run, from these different processes, you actually really come to the target that renewable energy is being produced offshore. And with that, I would like to conclude my webinar of the various objectives maritime spatial planning can have. And I look forward to seeing you for other webinar sections, such as the one on principles to be applied when doing maritime spatial planning. Thank you very much for your attention.